the talk of our cognitive biases and how they shape our lives at the beginning kind of fits in with this conversation that we are pawns, moved by forces which we do not understand, and our biases kind of make this, apparent in some way, like the fact that life goes back 4 billion years, and we are just, one extension of this branch. It makes me think like I'm studying philosophy at the moment, and like I'm just completely obsessed with this notion of information and how information like is everything. It is like what is the most important. It is like foundational to our ethic. It is foundational to what is good, or what we deem to be good. Like I think there is some universal notion of I think information and ordered complexity and everything moving in this direction that we're observing. I think that's where the answer of what is good lies. And I don't know what that means for us. Like, if that's the case, I still don't know what that actually means for how we should act, except that we should be conserving. We should be conserving life. We should be tending to this garden, but rather than trying to shape it, we should just kind of bear witness to what it produces and celebrate in that fact. And that's it. That's
Definitely.
it. That because I don't see what else we can do, because we're just so fallible and I'm not going to say closed, but just so limited.
Yeah, well, there's two things that brings up for me. One is the talk that kind of most mind blowing thing that ever happened to me. My buddy Andrew Despy saw me speaking at Rainbow Serpent Festival in Australia, and he at the time worked for the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, and was able to invite me in to speak in their innovation
lab.
lab.
The Commonwealth Bank. Oh, good.
I did in Sydney, yeah, like downtown. And I gave what was scheduled to be like, I think like a 30 or 40
I just want to bring
talk.
some context to some people here listening. Like Commonwealth Bank, there are people like it's one of the big four banks in Australia, and there are a lot of people trying to petition people to get their money out of the Commonwealth Bank because they are, funding fossil fuels, and like their money is not aligned with our long-term interests. So I just think it's so brilliant to get the idea of you being implanted in there to to talk about these things just is hilarious.
It was funny because I think I was scheduled for half an hour, and it was a Friday afternoon, and I ended up keeping like half the audience there for 2 hours after 5 p.m. And then we went across the street and like had a couple pictures, and like some of those people I was still hanging out with at midnight. It was a nod to Andrew Despy, who no longer works at the Commonwealth Bank, but nonetheless, I think demonstrated what I would consider a powerful act of social wizardry by even getting me in there. And the talk, which you can find the first part of the talk online on my YouTube channel, was called Tech Ethics as Psychedelic Parenting. And I was basically saying what you just said, which is that our technologies are not just going to do what we expect them to do. That there are always unintended consequences, and that it makes sense for us to think about these profound world-shaping technologies that are being born through us right now as children, and to treat them with an understanding of what it is to raise a child. I mean, I was not yet a father at the time that I gave this talk, but I've been thinking in this way for years. I gave a sort of a more fleshed out and robust version of this talk at Burning Man, which you can find on Future Fossils. But this idea that like, a child, you can teach a child, you can raise a child well, but you cannot determine what that child will become. And, this is a big piece of, if you look at Lewis Hyde's book, Common as Error, it's a fantastic piece on the history of intellectual property law, and how the patent was originally invented as sort of like that warm, shallow pond. It wasn't a way to control an idea. It was a way to nurture and incubate an idea before releasing it into the wild and into the commons, which like most people have forgotten about. Like this idea that like the things that we create are actually for other people and not just for our own personal gain. So like that's one thing. I agree with you that like, the right way to think about this is more like, especially as technologies that we have created, Danny Hillis has a great piece on this called "The Age of Enlightenment is Over." Like welcome to the age of entanglement. It's up on the MIT website. And Danny Hillis, who's a major figure, co-founder of the Long Now Foundation, was writing about how like new technologies, we're not even really inventing them, we're just sort of like growing them out of evolutionary algorithms, that like they're being as much designed by computers as they are by human beings. And so we're just sort of like specifying, oh, I want a bike that can hold up under these sort of pressures and constraints, and then what comes out looks more like a living creature than anything a human would have designed. This is true of like the computer architectures themselves now. And so more and more of this is about emergent engineering, which is a big area of study at SFI also. Yeah. And so again, like to your point, we're talking about a garden here. We're talking about like
sculpting. Gaia, right?
Yeah, we're talking about like moving it in sort of, I guess the last thing to say about this, because I think this is really key as far as like anchoring this at the human level, is that there's another fantastic book I read called More Than Two, which is a handbook for polyamorous relationships. And they talk about this garden metaphor in terms of, the human love life. Basically, like you don't control who you're going to meet. You have no control over who you're going to fall in love with. You only kind of have control over what plants you decide to rip up after the seeds blow into your garden. And like maybe the right thing to do is to like wait and see what's growing before you rip it up, or before like that there's that, if every some of these relationships are going to feed on one another, and some of them are going to nourish each other. And you don't really know until you just sort of allow those things to take their course, and to treat it not as a sort of Italian garden, historically, like these great gardens of the of the Enlightenment where everything is so perfectly manicured, but like wild crafting, like the indigenous peoples of Australia did for like 40,000 years or whatever, and the indigenous peoples of the Americas did, so that when the colonists came to these places, it looked wild to them. It looked like nobody was doing anything, when in fact it was people were taking very, very careful care. We're encouraging biodiversity and what we would call anti-fragility, Nassim Taleb's idea of like something that actually can take a hit and get stronger for it. And that's where we need to be right now, is wild crafting our technologies, our regulation, our personal relationships, and that means a good deal of surrender, for which our education in the modern world has not prepared us.
Is that what you mean by rewilding the future? Is it, because that's a
yes.
term that, yeah, okay, because I was going to ask you about that, because I wasn't quite sure. I had like an intuitive understanding of what that might mean, but that's what you were getting at.
Yeah, rewilding is like a whole cultural movement about just sort of releasing spaces, and I guess one really cool example that I learned about from Kat Harrison, an ethnobotanist, back in 2010, was this idea of daylighting. And daylighting is when, in the course of a city, the construction of a city, the natural waterways that flow through that city have been paved over and forced underground. Like, all of these creeks upon which New York was built still exist. They're just in the sewers, And what that does is it kills the delicate ecosystems that were supporting that whole area. And so there's been a movement in architecture over the last couple decades to restore those waterways to a natural balance, like restoring them to the atmosphere and to sunlight, and allowing rather than just like putrid chemicals collecting in them underground, allowing the sort of natural photosynthesis and bacterial and microbial and microfaunal balance to reassert itself. And like something like that has to be going on for the human imagination right now also, that we have paved over what it means to be human, over the last few hundred years, and it's time to, I think this is again one of these things that we may not actually have to force. I think it's a mistake of a lot of people in the so-called visionary or culture that, we're gonna, like, if you look back in the 60s and the way that like psychedelics were sort of, you know zealously forced upon so many people, like actually, like literally, like CIA putting LSD in the drinking water, Tim Leary saying everyone should take acid. um, you know we don't need to push the river, quote unquote, and a lot of us are sweeping the tide, as it were. And I think that really what this is not about so much forcing historical change. We're living through more than our share of it. It's about learning how to integrate those changes. And so it's like, I don't think that we actually need to, break the concrete of, the modern psyche so much as we need to know where to put it when the forces of history that we're living through now break it for us. That like those days are over. And it's just a matter of making sure that we pass through this age of metamorphosis as carefully as possible, and with
Well,
the
that we
sort
survive first and foremost, and that we, and
right,
then we're as
minimal
careful.
damage.
Yeah.
Yeah, like let's, how many buildings need to come down for this revolution to succeed? Hopefully not that many, right? Hopefully the systems, it's just this question of like how much destruction has to happen for this rebirth to occur. And like I don't think we need to force it. Like there's plenty of people out there that are doing the work for us, and plenty of transcendent natural processes over which we have no control that are dragging us kicking and screaming into the next age. But hopefully we stop kicking and screaming and can like learn
Move
to
with
enjoy
it,
the
rather
view.
than, yeah, and maybe harness some of the direction. If we're being pushed in one direction, maybe rather than fight against it, we can kind of work with it and influence it a little bit. Like
Yeah.
navigate briefly, just as much as we can on these turbulent oceans.
Or at least harness the friction of us being dragged into like spinning a turbine or something. Like close all material and energetic loops wherever possible. That's the circular thinking of the new integrated West, I think. Is like a return to that, like again a return to that kind of cyclical medicine wheel kind of idea of there's no such thing as waste. Bill Thompson talked about this, that the emergence of the chaotic dynamical world age came after World War II, when we realized that you can't just nuclear bomb your enemy into submission without drinking that fallout the next year, that there is no other, in a really like fundamental way, that it's like everything we do is downstream. Like we are downstream of all of our own actions eventually. And like when I
That's
spoke
karma,
to,
right? Like this is like the science of karma in a way.
it is like when I spoke to Mark Nelson for Future Fossils podcast. Mark lives here in Santa Fe. He's a really interesting guy. He wrote a book called The Wastewater Gardener, based on work that he did inside Biosphere 2, which was this completely balls out visionary experiment to reproduce 5 major Earth ecosystems inside a single building in Arizona back in the 1990s. There's a new documentary about it called Spaceship Earth. I cannot recommend highly enough to everyone to realize the kind of like innovative visionary cultural efforts that we're standing upon in this conversation. And Mark said, that the atmosphere of this building was so small that it made certain things that were hard to see at the global scale incredibly obvious at the scale of like trying to simulate a planet inside a building. And like, for example, the atmospheric regulation of this place was such that you could see the gas levels, you could see like the pollution meter start to go up after just a few hours if you accidentally cross-threaded the cap of a bottle of glue. Like it would get picked up by the sensitive readers that they were using to monitor the internal atmosphere of this place. And like Rusty Schweikart, who was a member of the Lindisfarne Association and an astronaut, U.S. astronaut, talked about this also. Talked about the way that space stations, these closed, autonomous systems reveal to us the damage that we're actually doing in a way that's not obvious. The the greenhouse effect was like plain as day in Biosphere 2. They were suffering immensely because they were producing too much carbon dioxide, and it nearly suffocated all 8 people living in the building. It's like a really interesting part of the sort of peril of that adventure narrative. But like that was 1993, and like a ton of people still don't get it because this atmosphere is enormous, and it's like you're not necessarily going to suffocate in your own house. Like you're not going to choke on your own exhaust yet, but like if you live in, I don't know, Beijing, it's considerably more obvious.
Yeah.
So at any rate, yeah, it's just like you said, it's like a science of karma. It's understanding that at some time scale, even if you don't live to see it, your kids will, or their kids will. And so we need to think about all of these things in a profoundly different way from the way that we have been thinking about them. Yeah.